Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to show you how you can add an additional domain controller to an existing domain. So every Active Directory domain should have more than one domain controller or a minimum of two domain controllers for high availability reasons. In our scenario, we only have one domain controller for our domain, that is the root domain controller, which is DC01. So what we're going to do is we'll add an additional domain controller for our domain Contoso. So let's take a look at the server, which is going to be our additional domain controller. It is running Windows Server 2012 as its operating system. The computer name is DC02 and it is currently in the workgroup. And we have assigned a static IP address, which is 192.168.10.2, and the subnet mask is 255.255.255.0. And as you can see, the server is just a standalone server currently. Also, take a look at the DNS server, which is pointing to the root domain controller. So it is set to 192.168.10.1, which is the IP address of our root domain controller, which is also a DNS server. This step is very critical if you're adding an additional domain controller to an existing domain. So I've already logged in as an administrator. So let me start creating the additional domain controller for our domain Contoso. First thing first, I'm going to open up Server Manager to add the Active Directory Domain Services role. So under Dashboard and under Configure this local server, I'm going to click on Add Roles and Features. Alright, I'll click Next on the welcome screen and I'll click on Role Based or Feature Based Installation and I'll click Next, and I'll select the server which is going to be our additional domain controller, which is DC02, and I'll click Next, and I'm going to select the Active Directory Domain Services, and it's going to tell us that these are the features that are required for Active Directory Domain Services role. So I'll simply click Add Features and I'll click Next, and by default it's going to select the required features for the Active Directory Domain Services role. So I'll leave the defaults and I'll click Next, and I'll click Next, and I'll check the option Restart the destination server automatically if required, and I'll click on the warning notification which says that it's going to restart without additional notifications. So I'll click Yes, and I'll click Install. Alright, now it's starting the installation. Okay, the installation has succeeded, and you can see there's a link to promote this server to a domain controller. So I'll click on the link. Alright, the Active Directory Domain Services configuration wizard opens up, and the first thing is deployment configuration, and we need to select the deployment option. Since we are adding an additional domain controller to an existing domain, we need to select the first option, which is add a domain controller to an existing domain, and then we need to specify the domain for which we are going to add this additional domain controller. So the domain name is contoso.local, and we need to supply the credentials to perform this operation. We need to supply domain administrator credentials. So I'll click change and I'll type in the domain administrator password of Contoso, and I'll click OK, and I'll click next. Alright, we would like to make this server as a DNS server as well, so we'll leave this box checked for DNS server. We would also like to make this server as a global catalog server, so we'll leave this option checked, which is global catalog. We don't want to make this server as a read-only domain controller, so we would leave this option unchecked. And for the site name, the default first site name is already selected by default, so we'll leave this selected, and we'll type the directory services restore mode password. Alright, in DNS options screen, it shows a warning message that says that a delegation for this DNS server cannot be created because it's not installed yet. So you can ignore this warning message and click next. Okay, in additional options, you have an option to install Active Directory or import the Active Directory data from a media such as CD or USB. Now, if your additional domain controller is separated by a slow WAN link, then it is recommended that we export the Active Directory data to a CD or to a USB from our root domain controller. And once we have the Active Directory data saved on our additional domain controller, we can come here and select this option which says install from media, and we can specify the path of the Active Directory data. In our case, our additional domain controller is not separated by a slow WAN link. Instead, it is on the local area network, so we'll uncheck that option. Now you can specify additional replication options, so you can specify from where the Active Directory data, from which domain controller the Active Directory data will be replicated. In our case, we only have one domain controller, which is our root domain controller, so we'll click that and we'll click next. And here you can specify the paths. In a production environment, it is recommended that you put these files on a different hard drive other than your operating system hard drive for redundancy. In our case, we'll leave the defaults and we'll click next. And you can review the options and selections that we made. Also, you can view the PowerShell script by clicking View Script. So this is the PowerShell script which is used to add the additional domain controller to an existing domain. Alright, we'll click next. Now it's going to run the prerequisite check to see if we can make this server as an additional domain controller. Alright, here you can see that the prerequisite checks have been passed successfully, so we'll click install to begin the installation. Alright, the installation has successfully completed, and we can close this message. and the server is going to restart. Alright, we are back at the login screen, so let me log back into the additional domain controller as a domain admin. Alright, we have logged back into the server, and here you can see the role which is saying that this server is a domain controller. So we have two domain controllers in our domain. The first one, DC01, is our root domain controller, and DC02 is our additional domain controller. Okay, we have to do one last thing. We have to see if we can replicate between two domain controllers. So let me go back into the server manager on DC02 and click on Tools and click on Active Directory Sites and Services. Alright, we have the console opened for Active Directory Sites and Services. I'll go under Sites and I'll go under Default First Site Name, and under Servers we can see we have two domain controllers. First one is DC01 and the other one is DC02. Alright, I'll go under DC02 and I'll right click on NTDS settings, and I'll click on the second option that says replicate configuration to the selected DC. So what it will do is it will replicate the configuration changes, or it will replicate the Active Directory configuration from DC01 to DC02. Alright, so it says Active Directory Domain Services has replicated the connection. Alright, this is good. So I'll click OK, and I'll again right click on NTDS settings on DC02, and I'll click on the first option which says replicate configuration from the selected DC, which means it's going to replicate the Active Directory configurations from DC02 to DC01. So let me click on that, and that also says that the replication has completed successfully. So I'll click OK and I'll click refresh, and you can see that I have an object created for replication and it is automatically generated. So if I right click, I can click replicate now. Alright, it has replicated. I'll click OK, and I'll go under DC01. I'll click on NTDS settings. I'll click refresh, and there you go. I can replicate from DC02, so I'll click replicate now, and it says that the replication has completed successfully, which is good. I'll click OK. So you can see that we can replicate between two domain controllers. The first one is the root domain controller, and the second one is the additional domain controller. So this is how you're going to add an additional domain controller to your existing domain. Thanks for watching.